told you that in just a single hour, everything you know, your home, your city, the world itself, could be reduced to ash. A burst of light so blinding it turns night into day, followed by a wave of fire that consumes everything in its path. This isn't the plot of some apocalyptic movie. It's the very real potential of nuclear war. But what happens after the bombs fall? What does life look like in the fallout? Let's rewind for a moment. The world today is home to nearly 13,000 nuclear warheads spread across 9 countries. That's more than enough firepower to destroy the planet many times over. But what would happen if these weapons were unleashed? The immediate aftermath would be cataclysmic. Cities vaporized, millions dead, and an environment poisoned beyond recognition. But the real nightmare begins after the mushroom clouds fade. Survivors, if you can even call them that, would face an unthinkable reality. Food? Gone. Water? Contaminated. Air? Choked with radioactive dust. Crops wouldn't grow, animals would perish, and sunlight would be blotted out by a nuclear winter. And then there's the fallout itself, a silent, invisible killer that lingers for years, even decades. But let's dive deeper into what life in the fallout might actually look like. Imagine huddling in a makeshift shelter, rationing canned beans and stale crackers, knowing it could be weeks or months before the radiation outside drops to survivable levels. That is, if you were lucky enough to have a shelter in the first place. Most people wouldn't. They'd be left to wander a wasteland, their skin burning from radiation exposure, their bodies wasting away from hunger. And what about society? Governments would collapse, supply chains would shatter, and any sense of order would evaporate. It's not just the infrastructure that would be destroyed, trust would be too. Neighbors would turn on each other, fighting over scraps of food or clean water. The concept of civilization as we know it would cease to exist. But here's where things get really interesting. While some survivors might cling to life in underground bunkers or isolated enclaves, others might attempt to rebuild. The question is, could they? Could humanity ever recover from an event so devastating? The short answer, maybe. But it wouldn't be easy. Scientists predict that a nuclear war would trigger a nuclear winter, where soot and ash in the atmosphere block out the sun, causing global temperatures to plummet. Crops wouldn't grow, leading to widespread famine. Entire ecosystems would collapse. And even if the climate began to stabilize after a few years, the radiation would linger for decades, poisoning the soil and water. But humans are nothing if not resilient. Throughout history, we've survived plagues, famines, and natural disasters. Could we survive this? Maybe. But it would take a level of cooperation and ingenuity that we've rarely shown on a global scale. And even then, the world we rebuild wouldn't look anything like the one we lost. Let's talk about technology for a moment. You might think that in a post-apocalyptic world, all our fancy gadgets and innovations would give us a leg up. But here's the thing. Most of our technology relies on complex supply chains and infrastructure. Without factories, power grids, or internet networks, your smartphone is just a shiny brick. And those solar panels or wind turbines? Great in theory, but useless if you don't have the tools or knowledge to maintain them. So what would people do? They'd go back to basics. Farming, if the soil wasn't too radioactive. Hunting, if there were any animals left to hunt. Bartering, because money would be meaningless. It's a grim existence, but it's one that humans have lived before. The question is whether we'd have the skills and the will to do it again. And then there's the psychological toll. Imagine losing everything and everyone you've ever known. Imagine living every day in fear of radiation, of starvation, of other people. It's not just about surviving physically, it's about surviving mentally. History tells us that some people would rise to the challenge, finding purpose and meaning even in the darkest of times. But others would break, unable to cope with the sheer weight of it all. But here's where it gets really complicated. Let's say humanity does manage to rebuild, even in the smallest way. What kind of world would we create? Would we learn from our mistakes, abandoning the weapons and ideologies that led to our destruction? Or would we fall into the same patterns, repeating the same mistakes? There's one chilling possibility that we can't ignore, that some survivors might see the devastation and think, we need bigger weapons next time. It's happened before. World War I was called the war to end all wars, and yet just a few decades later, World War II erupted. deadlier than ever. But let's not end on a completely hopeless note. While the prospect of nuclear war is terrifying, it's also preventable. Every day, scientists, diplomats, and activists work tirelessly to reduce the risk of such a catastrophe. And while it's easy to feel powerless in the face of such a massive threat, remember this. History is full of examples where humanity came together to solve seemingly impossible problems. The Cold War ended without a single nuclear bomb being dropped. Treaties have been signed, arsenals reduced. It's not perfect, but it's progress. So, what's the takeaway here? The threat of nuclear war is real, and its consequences would be unimaginably devastating. But it's also a reminder of what's at stake, the incredible, fragile world we live in, and the responsibility we have to protect it. Before we wrap up, let me leave you with one thought. The future isn't written. It's up to us, what we build, what we destroy, and what we choose to leave behind. If you're as fascinated by these questions as I am, hit that subscribe button. Let's explore more together.